We began yesterday, we went through a number of different scenarios, all told, I think 15. And the Mishnah now establishes that in addition to what we call a Saras Erva, where there's a tour of Yibum, there's also a halacha of Tsoroseihem. So I'd like to give a scenario for Saras Sara. And that would be a completion of what we started yesterday, just this last addition to yesterday, and then we go on in the Mishnah. And there are a number of Tosafos in here at the beginning of the Masechet that Mitzvah Hashem we hope to get a chance to look at. So what's the case of Tsaras, Tsarasa? We have three brothers, we'll call them Ruvain, Shimon, and Levi. And Shimon marries Sarah, the daughter of Ruvain, which makes Sarah the first on this list of Harayos, Bito, vis-a-vis Ruvain. Now Shimon, in addition to marrying Sarah, the daughter of Ruvain, he marries another woman, and we'll call her Rivka. Now, the status of Rivka vis-a-vis Ruvain is going to be Tsoras Bito, because Shimon is married to two wives. He's married to Sarah and to Rivka. Sarah is the daughter of Ruvain. And that's common that a man marries the daughter of his brother. I mean, if there's a difference in age, that's quite common. What's a little bit uncommon is that the younger brother Shimon dies. Now, what happens is, when Shimon dies, his two wives, Sarah and Rivka, fall for Yibum to his brother Ruvain. We'll get to Levi in just a minute. But as far as Ruvain, his brother Ruvain is concerned, Rivka is a Tsaras Erva. Why? Because Rivka shares her husband, may rest in peace, Shimon, with Sarah, who's the daughter of Ruvain. So clearly, as we discussed at great length yesterday, Rivka is Tsaras Erva. Okay. Now, the wives of Shimon fall for Yibum to Levi, the third brother. As far as Levi is concerned, there's no status of Erva, so there's no Tsaras Erva as well. And none of these two women who are the almanos of Shimon, whether it be Sarah or Rivka, are in any way related to Levi, except for the fact that these are Levi's sisters-in-law, meaning Eshes Achim, which is the mitzvah of Yibum. Now Levi goes ahead and he marries second. Levi marries the second wife of Shimon, meaning not the Erva to Ruvain, which would be Sarah, but rather he marries Rivka. Fine. So now, if Levi dies, then his two wives will fall for Yibum to Ruvain. Why? Because Levi, in addition to marrying Rivka, he also married Rachel. So Levi had two wives, Rivka and Rachel. Now Levi dies. The only brother that's alive is Ruvain. On the first round, when Shimon married Sarah, then clearly Sarah, the daughter of Ruvain, is an Erva of Bito, and Shimon's other wife Rivka is Saras Erva. All that is vis-a-vis Ruvain. Now that Levi steps into the arena, and he marries Rivka, is not an erva to Ruvain. She was only a tsaras erva to Ruvain. And what made her into a tsaras erva to Ruvain was the fact that Shimon was married to both Sarah, the daughter of Ruvain, as well as Rivka. And when Shimon died, we established that Rivka was the tsaras erva of Shimon. But now, when Levi dies, and he leaves two wives, one is Rachel, the other is Rivka. Well, Rivka is not an erva to Shimon, the only live brother. She's not the daughter of Shimon. Sarah was the daughter of Shimon. Narvaz, Rivka had the status of tsaras erva. And now when Rachel falls to Yibum as the wife of the late Levi to Reuven, can Reuven be miyabem Rachel? And the answer is no. Why not? Because Rachel's status is that of a tsaras tsara. Why? Because the status of Rivka was a tsaras erva, because Rivka, together with Sarah, was married to Shimon, and Shimon died, and therefore we established the status of Rivka as tsaras erva, and now Rachel, who's married to Levi, together with Rivka, because Levi married Rivka, and that was a mitzvah of Yibum when he married his late brother Shimon's wife Rivka. And now he also married another woman named Rachel. Rachel doesn't fall for Yibum to Reuven because Rivka's status vis-a-vis Reuven is that of a tsaras erva. So this is tsaras tsara, meaning Rachel is excluded from Yibum vis-a-vis Reuven because she is a tsara to Rivka, who in turn was a tsara to Sarah on the first nefila. And therefore the status of Rachel is that of a tsaras tsara. And if I can offer the following numbers, which I'm not 100% sure if this is correct, but at least it helps me remember the halacha, I think what happens is that when Shimon dies and he leaves his two wives, Sarah and Rivka, since the Torah excludes Rivka as a tsaras erva because Sarah is Reuven's daughter, the status now of Rivka becomes that of an erva. And what does that mean? After all, she was married to Shimon, he's Reuven's brother. Reuven, in one of the various arayos that the Torah prohibits, is not allowed to marry his brother's wife. And therefore, Rivka, although she's not in any way biologically related to Reuven, but nevertheless, since there is no Yibum, and the reason why there's no Yibum vis-a-vis Rivka in the first nefila, meaning after Shimon died, why can't Rivka be misyabemis to Reuven? And the answer is because of erva. Because of tsaras erva. She is a tsara together with Sarah, and Sarah herself is an erva to Reuven. She's Reuven's daughter. Now what happens is that since there's no mitzvah of yibum to the tsaras erva now is an erva, because the only removal of the status of erva of Eshes Achiv, my brother's wife, is the mitzvah of yibum. When the mitzvah of yibum is relieved, then the erva of Eshes Achiv is back in full force. And now Rivka becomes an erva to Reuven, insofar as she was married to Reuven's brother Shimon. Now when Levi marries Rivka and Rachel, and then he dies, and now there's an nefila of Yibum of both Rachel and Leah to Reuven, well, guess what? Rachel is a tsaras erva. Again, we call her a tsaras tsara, but in effect, the lumpus, I think, conceptually of Sarah is Sarah. Why? Because Rivka now is an Erva, because she fell for Yibum to Ruvain, and there was no possibility of consummating that Yibum. And the mitzvah was totally inapplicable because she was a Tsaras Erva. Now she becomes an Erva, meaning she was always an Erva. I don't mean to say that she all of a sudden magically became an Erva. That's not so. She was always an Erva. When she was married to Shimon, her relationship to Reuven now became that of an Erva. That's for sure. But there should have been a mitzvah of Yibum when Shimon died, and there's no mitzvah of Yibum. What blocks the mitzvah of Yibum? It's the fact that she, Rivka, is a tzara to Sarah, Reuven's daughter, to an Erva. She's a tzaras Erva. Once it's tzaras Erva, and that blocks the mitzvah of Yibum, then the Mela, nothing, no force came into being to undermine and neutralize the status of Rivka as an Erva. She is Achos. She is, Ashes Achim. And therefore, when she, after being married to Levi, falls to Yibum together with Levi's other wife, Rachel, in front of Reuven, he's the only brother left at this point, so that's the only story in town. Now, she, Rivka, is an Erva, and therefore Rachel is an Erva. And there's no mitzvah of Yibum. But that, in any event, is the case of Tsaras. Okay, now we have a few things on the agenda today. Let's first read the part of the Mishnah that is printed on Daf Beis Amud Beis. Doesn't mean in any way we're finished with Beis Amud Aleph, but the Mishnah on the top of Daf Beis Amud Beis speaks about Eshes Achiv Shelo Haya Be'olam. And that halacha is pretty clear. We don't need any complicated diagrams for that, because what that means is that at the moment of Nefila for Yibum, Reuven and Shimon are alive, two brothers. Shimon died, but Levi has not yet been born. And if Levi hasn't yet been born, then he doesn't share Olamo Shel Reuven. And he writes here, Meis Ha'ach, we'll call him Shimon, who died, Kodem Shenolad, before Levi was born. So the Mes and this Yavam did not share one moment of time in which they were alive in this world together. Hence, there's no Nefila for Yibum. Because the Torah says that Ki Yeshvu Achim Yachdav, that's the opening line in Parshas Kiseitze, in the Parsha of Yibum, Umeis Echad Minah. So it's Ki Yeshvu Achim Yachdav. And then Yevama Yavo Alel. Here, there's no Ki Yeshvu Achim Yachdav. So it means that this wife of Shimon, when Shimon dies, could fall for Yibum to Reuven, because Reuven and Shimon were both alive at the same time, but she would not fall for Yibum to Levi, because Levi was born after Shimon's demise. So the potential Yavam, we'll call him Levi, was born after Shimon died. Eina misyabemes lo. There's no Yibum relationship between the wife of Shimon and Levi, because Levi did not, if you could use the term, coexist with Shimon. So therefore he writes the following. Im hayu shnei achim ba'olam yachdav Reuven v'Shimon nasa Reuven es Sarah umeis below banim. So now Shimon went ahead and he married Sarah. Shimon dies without any children. V'achar kach nolad Levi, achiyam ashlishi. Levi now is born. He's the third brother. Sarah, Ashes, Ruvain, Misyabemis Shimon, because Shimon and Ruvain had what we call a yeshiva achas, below Levi. But Levi could not be Miyabim Sarah, the wife of Reuven, because Levi and Reuven they never coexisted. In Yivma Shimon, now something is interesting. Shimon was Miyabim Sarah after the death of his brother Reuven. And then Reuven went ahead. V'nasa Isha Acheres, in addition to Sarah, the daughter of Shimon, the wife of Shimon, he married another woman by the name of Rivka. And now Reuven dies. So he leaves Sarah and Rivka, his two wives. Al Afshe Shimon v'Levi Chaitzalehem Yeshiva Achas. In other words, Levi was born after Shimon died, after Reuven died, but Shimon was alive at the time of Levi's birth. Mikamakom shtei nashim shel Shimon einam misyabnos leLevi. Why is that so? Sarah einam misyabemis lo mishum shekvar nesra olav be'iser eishes ach machmas Reuven sharei bemisas Reuven lo haisa lo ba mitzvas yibu mishum shelo haya Reuven ba'olamo shel Levi. Wow, this is very fascinating. Levi comes into existence and Reuven's already gone. Reuven's wives, therefore, have no nefila for Yibum to Levi because they weren't ba'olam achas. At that point, therefore, we established that Reuven's wives are an erva to Levi, which is really fascinating when you think about it, because these wives were married to Reuven during his lifetime, but Levi wasn't alive. And that's irrelevant. So therefore, he says, Al-Af, even though Shimon v'Levi haisa yeshiva achas ba'olam, mikol makom shtei nashim shel Shimon einon misyabmos leLevi, and we'll go one by one. Sarah einon misyabemis lo mishum shekvar nesra olav. She already is asura on Levi as an erva. Be'iser eishes ach machmas Reuven. And why is that? Because Sarah was married to Reuven, and there was no Yibum to Levi because Levi wasn't alive at the moment of Reuven's death. Sharei bemisas Reuven lo haisa lo ba. Levi had no relationship of mitzvahs Yibum to Sarah. Mishum shel Levi lo haya ba'olama shel Reuven. Mishum kach din ervas eishes ach sheba kidin kol arayos hashnuyos b'mishnasei. Poteres miyibum v'af Rivka tzarasav tur miyibum shel Levi shekain he tzaras ervas eishes ach shelo haya lo b'olam. So it's really fascinating because what happens is that Reuven marries a woman and Shimon's alive. With Reuven's death, she falls for Yibum to Shimon. She does not fall to Yibum to Levi when Levi comes into existence. And therefore, that woman who is married to Reuven, that's Sarah, she is an erva to Levi. It's very fascinating because Shimon was miyabim her. He went ahead, he married Sarah with the death of his brother Reuven. And now when Shimon dies, you would think that she would now fall for Yibum to Levi, because Levi and Shimon coexisted, but it doesn't matter. She becomes an erva to Levi the very moment that Levi comes into this world because of the fact that she was married to Reuven. And because with Reuven's death, she does not have a zikas yibum to Levi, therefore she remains Ashes Achiv to Reuven. So when Shimon dies, there's no possibility for Levi to be miyabim Sarah, nor another wife, Rivka, that Shimon married, because she becomes a Tzaras Erev. So that's what we have here. Now let's just read the next part of the Mishnah. First of all, the Mishnah has kaloso. Kaloso means that, let's say, Yitzchak, the son of Reuven, marries Rivka. And then Shimon, the brother of Reuven, marries Rivka after Reuven dies. Now, at this point, what we have is that Rivka, right? Rivka was married to Yitzchak. Yitzchak is the son of Reuven. Therefore, Rivka is the daughter-in-law, Kaloso, of Reuven. And now Shimon Achi Reuven marries Rivka, and he's marrying the daughter-in-law of his brother Reuven. If Shimon is married to another woman, we'll call her Leah, then neither Rivka nor Leah will fall for Yibum to Reuven with Shimon's death. And that is because Rivka is halaso, because Rivka was married to Yitzchak, the son of Reuven, and therefore she patters up Leah as well because of Tzaras Erev. Then the Mishnah says, Arei elu pochos tzaraseim, v'tzaras tzaraseim min hachalitza min hayibum ad sofa o. So we gave examples of Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. You could give examples where Yehuda and Yisachar come into the picture, and there'll always be a din of a tzaras erva that becomes like an erva, such that hatzara in the next round is a tzaras erva, even though we call it tzaras erva. V'kulan imesu o mianu o nisgarshu o shenimtzu islandis tzaroseim mutaros. Now the Mishnah gives a whole list of cases in which a tzara is misyabems, in contrast to everything that we learned until now, that there's no yibum for the tzaras erev. Okay. So the first case is Mason. You have one of the 15 arayos married to Shimon, and Shimon marries another wife who's now at tzaras ereva. So in other words, any of these 15 women that Shimon chose to marry are related to his brother Reuven. When Shimon dies, his two wives do not fall for Yibum to Reuven. One because she's an erva to Reuven, the other because she's a tzaras erva. But now what happens is that the erva wife of Shimon, when I say erva, I mean she's an erva on Reuven, she dies. So it means that when Reuven actually died, he left only one wife, who was the tzara, I should say when Shimon died, right? So when Shimon died, the wife that was related to Reuven, let's say it was Reuven's daughter, she had already died. So what are we left with? We're left with another wife who was a tzaras erva. The Mishnah says there will be Yibum. That now Reuven will be miyaben Shimon's other wife. Why? Because at the time of Shimon's death, Reuven's erva, meaning the other wife of Shimon, was not alive. That's case number one. Case number two is mianu. So let's say a few words about Miyun. On a Doraisa level, a father could marry off his daughter who's a Ketana, but no other relative, not even this girl's mother, and certainly not her brothers, have the yad, the power to marry off their daughter or their sister, who's a Ketana. However, the Rabbanan created a new entity called Ishus. It's called Nisue Miyun, which means that this girl's mother and her brothers could marry her off when she's a Ketana. If the father died, she's the Yisoma Me'eviyah. And that marriage is marriage midrabanan. And whoever marries her, he is considered married to this woman. She's a Ketana. However, as long as she's a Ketana, she can walk out of that marriage. And the Rabbanan instituted something called Kiddushay Miyun. And Miyun means that she makes a declaration. We have to see whether it's in front of a Bezdin or in front of two Eidim, and she declares, I'm out of here. That's called Miyun. Now, the case in our Mishnah is where she was Mima'enes before her husband died, which means that by the time her husband died, there was no relationship between her and her husband. So if he's married to another woman and he dies without children, that other woman will fall for Yibum to his living brother because there's no Erev relationship between the two. Even though there was an Erev relationship with the younger wife, but she was Mima'enes before the death of her husband. So by the time Shimon died, there was no relationship whatsoever to this girl. He's left Shimon with one almana that he leaves, and Reuben will be miaving that almana. Same law applies, as the Mishnah points out. If the erva to Reuven received a get during the lifetime of Shimon, her husband, and so by the moment that Shimon died, the erva of Reuven, the Yavam, was already divorced, and therefore, if Shimon is married to another wife, she's not a tzaras erva, because at the moment of Shimon's death, he only has one wife. Then the Mishnah says, Nimtzu Islandus. A man marries a woman, and in all naivete and all good faith, and as it turns out, she's an islandess. We can only know that when she becomes 20 years old, and she has simone islandess, certain biological phenomena. The law of an islandess is that unless proven otherwise, we assume it was a mekach tos, that the Kiddushin were predicated on mistaken information. He had no reason to suspect that she was an islandess. He married this young, beautiful teenage girl, and as it turns out, she's an islandess. So that's Oker the Kiddushin L'mafreya, which means that if, let's say, Reuven was married to two women, one of whom was an erva to Reuven, and Shimon did not know that this woman was an islandess. She turns out to be an islandess, and therefore the Kiddushin is completely nullified L'mafreya retroactively, such that now the only woman who will fall for Yibum to Reuven when Shimon dies is the other woman, who's not an erva. And the fact that at one point in time, Reuven was married to an erva is irrelevant because that woman is an islandess. And once we disclose that she's an islandess, the Kiddushin, the marriage relationship between Shimon and this woman is completely null and void, retroactive. Now, one of the issues of this very long Tosfos here on Daf Beis Amud Beis is going to be what happens if Shimon decides that despite the fact that she's an islandess, I still want to remain married to her. Again, he has another wife, so he can fulfill the mitzvah period review with his other wife who's biologically capable of having children. But Kiblet, he accepts the fact that she's an islandess. Would that undermine all that the Mishnah is telling us, bring her back into the parsha of Yibum? She's an erva, and therefore the other wife of Shimon is a tsaras erva. So we haven't gotten to that discussion. I'm just mentioning it to you up front. So in all these cases, the Mishnah adds these two words that formulate the rule that applies to all the above cases, sarosei and mutaros, which means that that woman who was not included in the nefila liyimo when her husband died, either because she was kiddushay miyun and she was mema'enes, or she had full kiddushin to this man, this Shimon, but he gave her a get, or because she turned out to be an islandess, or if, let's say, she died before her husband died, she predated her husband in death. In all those cases, the other wife of Shimon will fall for Yibam to Reuven, because at the time of the Nephilim, meaning at the moment of Shimon's death, Shimon had only one wife, and she was not an heir. That's what we have here in the Mishnah. Now, a few days ago, I had mentioned an insight of Reb Shimon Shkar. And I'm going to give it a shot, a second, shall I say, try up at bat to understand Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon bases himself on a Gemara later on in Masechet Yevamot. We'll get to it hopefully very soon. That the halach of tsaras erva, that she doesn't get yibum, is derived from a gzeira shava. What is this gzeira shava? In the parsha of Harayos, one of the various forbidden relationships that's listed in the parsha is achos isha. And the Torah says in Dvarim, in Parshas Kitetse, it says, Isha el achosa lo tikach litzor legalos ervasa aleha. We'll add and emphasize the word aleha, bichayeh. Okay? And that's the law that you cannot marry your wife's sister, during the lifetime of your wife. After your wife dies, you're allowed to marry her sister. But the word is oleh. Now, we fast forward to Parshas Yibu. And in Parshas Yibu, the word oleha again surfaces. And it says, Yevamot yavo oleha. So the first pasuk, Oleha, is in the parsha of Arayos. The second pasuk is in the parsha of Yibum. Oleha appears twice. The first time in Parshas Kedoshim, and the second time in Parshas Kitetse. What does this Gzeira Shava Oleha teacher? The Gemara says, Ma Oleha ha'omer biyavam is b'makom mitzvah af Oleha ha'omer bi'achos isha is b'makom mitzvah. So when the Torah says Yivama Yavo Oleha, he's talking about the mitzvah of Yibam. And when it says Isha lachosa lo tikach, etc., it says legalos avel Oleha. It must be talking about a situation of Yibum, in which two brothers married two sisters, and Shimon was married to the sister of Reuven's wife, which is called Achos Ishto. Now, Reuven dies, and his wife, who's Achos Ishto, falls for Yibum to Reuven. And in that scenario, the Torah says, Lo tika, don't marry her. Even though there's a mitzvah of Yibum, after all, Shimon was married to her, my brother was married to her, and he died. It doesn't matter. Why? Because she's Achos Ishto. She is the sister of my wife. And in the context of Yibum, like any other context, a man is not allowed to be married to two sisters. And the Oleh is teaching me that there's no mitzvah of Yibum because the Torah says Lo Tika. And how do I know that Lo Tika is talking about Yibum? A scenario of Yibum because of the Gzeir Shava Oleh. Now, in the pasuk, the first Oleha of the Erva of Achos Ishto, it says Lo Tikach Litzra. And the Torah added the word Litzra. The Gemara derives from the word Litzra that not only is Achos Ishto excluded from Yibum, but even Saras Achos Ishto is excluded from Yibum. And that's indicated by the word Litzra. So Shimon had two wives, one of whom was Achos Ishto of Reuven, the other was not. The other one will not fall for Yibum because of the extra pasuk Litzra. Then the Gemara says that from this case of Achos Ishto, we use it as a paradigm, what we call a binyan av, and that's going to teach us l'chol harayos that their tzoros eino misyavos. However, there's another sugya. So the sugya that we just learned now, we sort of summarized the Gzeir Shava to Achos Ishto, is on Daf Gimel in Masechet Yevamot. Now we fast forward to Daf Ches. And on Daf Ches, the Gemara quotes two opinions about the following issue. The first opinion says that even the Erva herself, if not for this drasha of Oleh Aleha, Haisa Misyabenes, she would fall for Yibum, which means that this Gzeir Shav is not just teaching me the halach of Litzra, of Tsaras Erva, but it's teaching me the halach of Erva itself. That Lo Sikach, in the context of a Yibum situation, generates an Isur, or I shouldn't say generates, but continues and gives life, continued life to the Isur Erva Achos Ishto, despite the fact that there would have been a mitzvah of Yibum. And we only know that from this Gzeir Shava Oleh Oleh. If in absence of this Gzeir Shava, we would have said, all right, the Torah had left out the word Oleha, she's Achos Ishto, she's an Erva, but now she fell for Yibum. And just like the Torah was matir, the Erva of Eishes Achiv, the Torah was likewise matir, the Erva of Achos Ishto. That would have been the Havamina had we not had the Gzeir Shava of Oleh Oleh and the Lo Sika. Rava disagrees. Rava says that Erva Atzma Pshita She'ena Misyabenes. The Torah in the midst of Yibum permitted the Isur Erva of Eishes Achiv specifically and exclusively. There's no other Havamina that we could have said that another Erva would have been included in Yibum. The mitzvah of Yibum does not have the power to override all the arayas and all the chivei creases on the whole list enumerated there in Kedoshim and Achrimos Kedoshim. There's a specific matir regarding the erva of Eishes Achel, but only Eishes Achel. And Rava says, "Ein esei docha lo saseh." The essay of Yibum, Pshita, for sure, without any limudim, would not override the losaseh of an erva, because an erva has an isa kares to it. And lotaseh only can be pushed aside, and we can take an essay and override a lotaseh if it's a regular classic lav. But if the lav is upgraded to a very severe level of severity, of chumrah, it's a chiyuv kares, then an essay cannot override a chiyuv kares. In the case of Mila b'Shabbos, the Gemara has a special drasha. But if not for the special drasha, Mila would certainly not override Shabbos. And so too, if you had a case of a mitzvah on Shabbos that required an avera of Shabbos, an essay cannot override a losas of that heavy stature like Shabbos. And arayos, since they generate a chiyuv kares, therefore they're on a special status of chumras avera, and an essay cannot override them. So Rava learns the the upshot of the Gzeira Shava is only the word litzra, to teach you that just like an erva would undermine the mitzvah of Yibum, so too the tsaras erva is excluded from the mitzvah of Yibum. And now we're ready for Abshur. Now, it's interesting that there was a Rosh Yeshiva here in Bnei Brak, in the Yeshiva Panovich, by the name of Shmuel Rozovsky. You remember that name at all? Does it ring a bell? And he was a Talmud of Reb Shimon Shkop. And some of the Torah that we have from Reb Shimon was transmitted in Reb Shimon's name by Reb Shmuel Rozovsky. Although Reb Shimon published a lot of his Torah in his lifetime, and not all of it. We have a number of svarim from Reb Shimon, but much of it was what we call Mipia Shmuel, was transmitted orally by his students. My father, Zichron Livracha, had a very close friend who was a Rav in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. His name is Rabbi Silver. And he was 1 year older than my father. Went to yeshiva together. And Rabbi Silver was a student of Reb Shimon Shkop. They would not allow my father into the class at yeshiva college because my father was too young. He missed the cutoff point by 1 year. So he didn't hear Reb Shimon. But his friend, his close buddy, Rabbi Silver, Olav Shalom, whose father maybe you heard of, Rabbi Lazer Silver, this Rabbi Silver was a Talmud of Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon only stayed in the yeshiva for about 8 months, and the Gedolim called him back to Europe. You know, they didn't think that yeshiva college was the right place for Reb Shimon Shkop. So there were some issues there about, you know. In any event, Reb Shimon, Rabbi Silver said, was so charismatic as a Rosh Yeshiva that after he left the yeshiva and he was replaced by Reb Moshe Soloveitchik, he said Rabbi Silver, and a lot of his chevra had it very difficult to get used to Reb Moshe Soloveitchik. They were so enamored by the charisma of Reb Shimon and his pedagogic ability. Reb Shimon would get the guys very involved. You know, Reb Moshe's derech was to come in and he gave a shiur for 35, 40 minutes. Very few comments were made. One of the people who my father used to say, would pipe up and argue with Reb Moshe was Chaim Zimmerman, if you ever heard that name. But generally speaking, Reb Moshe came in, and it was a powerful shiur. Every moment, every sentence was action-packed, and he walked out of the shiur after 35, 40 minutes. My Rebbe would go on for a minimum of 2 hours, sometimes 5 hours. But Reb Moshe went for 40 minutes. In any event, Reb Shimon is quoted by Rav Rozovsky as an introduction to Masechet Yevamot. And Reb Shimon asks the following question, which Reb Shimon, presented to the Talmidim as something very fundamental. He said, Ha'im introduces one possibility, and then we'll get to O Dilma, second possibility. First possibility is that Aliba Diemes, Sibas Dechias Yibum, who Mishum Iser Kares Sheba. In the case of Ereva, there is no Yibum because of the Iser Kares. In the case of an Ereva, as we saw in Rava's frame of reference, Rav on Daf says there was never a halamin, it was pshita, that an erva cannot be overridden by an essay of Yibum. I only need the Gzeir Shava for the din of Saras erva, where there is no erva. But any erva on the list of the 15, the Dover Pasha, I don't need a Gzeir, I don't need a Alfusa, according to Rava, for anything that we learned until this point, except for Tzara. But as far as Arayos are concerned, they themselves, if Shimon is married to the daughter of Reuven and Shimon dies childless, certainly it never crossed anyone's mind. Certainly the daughter of Reuven would not fall for Yibum to Reuven, her father. And the reason for that is because the essay of Yibum cannot override the Isser of Kares, of Arayos. If Shimon was married to another wife who is not related to Reuven, she logically should have fell for Yibum to Reuven. And the reason she doesn't is because of this Gzeir Shava Litra, that she's a Tzaras Erva. Oh, Dil. Now we get to the second possibility. B'drashas Oleha, Shalom Torah, Tur Mechuda Shel Erva. Shemufkasi Ikar Mitzvahs Yibum. He suggests the following, that perhaps we need the drasha of Aleha, the Gzeir Shava, to teach us that an erva is potter from Yibum. What's that about? He says the following. Even according to that opinion in the Gemara on Daf Ches, who says that if not for the drasha of Oleh, Lahatir, Erva, Biyibum, Yitochen Lomar, it's possible that what do we derive from Oleh, according to that first opinion, that anonymous Amora? Oleh Mashvia, She'iser Erva, Eino Nitar Liyibum. That we derive from this Gzeir Shava that Erva doesn't allow itself, it's not vulnerable or exposed to the power of an essay to be docha, to override the Erva. Iser Erva Eino Nitan Liyibum. O Dilma, Afli Achar Oleha, Imachen Hoyaba Mitzvahs Yibum, Hoyanitar Iser Ha'erva, Elamashvienu Akasu, She'erva Mufkas Ve'ikar Din Yibum. Below Mishuma Iser Shaba. Okay. We'll come back to this point in just a minute. And now let's fast forward to Rav. Yesh l'stapek af l'shitas Rava, af shepshitu she'ena erva misyabemes, bishum sha'asura l'syabem, v'ein tzarech be'oleh, the Gzeir Shava k'dei liosra, b'kol makom yitached, sheli'achar ha'oleh, hischadish b'ptur erva, milvad ha'isur shem. What Rav Shimon is raising here is the possibility that Oleha has something to tell us, even in the case of an erva. And in addition to the Iser erva, which, let's say, according to Rava, we'll go with the simple approach, right? Rava says the Isur Erva would certainly block the mitzvah of Yibum. Says Reb Shimon, but there's another halacha, an additional halacha. And above and beyond the Isur Erva, there's a new halacha that we derive from this Gzeir Shava of a Leah, that an Erva doesn't fall for Yibum. Irrelevant to the Isur of Kares, the Isur So again, even though it's pshita that as far as the Isur Yibum is concerned, the Isur Yibum would certainly block the mitzvah of Yibum according to Rava, but nevertheless, we need Aliyah, the Pasuk Aliyah, to teach me that Erva is outside of the realm of Yibum, regardless of the Isur, irrelevant of the Isur. There are two reasons why Erva is excluded from Yibum. One is because of the Isur Erva, and Rav is holding Ein Esei Docha Isur Kares. And number two, because Aleh teaches me that an Erva is outside of Yibum. She just doesn't fall for Yibum, period. And Reb Shimon is going to create an afternoon. Reb Shimon is willing to introduce this Hakira into the framework of the first Mandi Omar, who says that if not for Oleo, we would have said that the essay of Yibum, that mitzvah, would override the Isur Kares of an Erva. Because now we have to know what is the maskana, the final line after we have Oleha. Is it telling me that the Isur Erva does not lend itself to a heter by virtue of mitzvahs Yibum, meaning that although Esei Docha Losas, according to this first man, the Yomer Rava would have applied, but here it doesn't apply, and the essay does not have the power to override the Losas. Or shall we say that Oleh, in a case where she would have a mitzvah Yibum, right? We say that the mitzvah of Yibum would override the Isur Erva, according to this first man, the Yomer. No, Oleh is telling me that the Erva itself is outside of the parsha, outside of the parameters of the mitzvah of Yibum, of the din of Yibum. And Meinaf Yibum, he says the following. Echriach Rab Shimon Kitzad Hasheni, Sheptur Erva Hu Din Bifnei Atzmo, V'ena Noveh Mi Isur Erva Shabbat, Sharei B'tzara, V'adai Din Pturhu, Sheken Kosku Rashi V'Tosfos, Shebitzoras Achos Isha, right? That's where Reuven and Shimon married two sisters. Ein Isur Achos Isha, Ela Biyosa Soras Erva, Harehi Nifteres Miyibum. So you have Shimon who married the sister of Reuven's wife, meaning that Reuven and Shimon, two brothers, married two sisters. And Shimon is married to another woman as well. And that other woman is Itzaras Erva. Rashi and Tosas say that there's no Isur of Achos Isha in this case. Ella, no Isur of Achos Isha. Meaning, even though we'll call her Rachel is the sister of Reuven's wife, Leah, nevertheless, there's no Isur Erva of Achos Ishto with regard to Reuven vis-a-vis Rachel. But she's potter from Yibum. Why? Because of the din of Atzara. The Mela Choser Bo Isur Eshes Ach. The erva is that she, we call her Rachel, was married to his brother, meaning to Reuven's brother Shimon, but not because Leah is the sister of Rachel. Now, this Sarah, called a Rachel, doesn't fall for Yibum. And yet Rashi and Tosafot says that there's no Isser of Achos Ishto in this case. So it means that with the death of Shimon and he's childless, the Isser of Achos Ishto is completely gone. And the Erva doesn't exist. The only reason she cannot fall for Yibum is because of the Isser of Eshes Achiv, since we derive from Oleh and Litzar that there's no Yibum in the case of Itzaras Erva. The Hechrei says, Reb Shimon, Shedin Hatzara Maschil Miptur, that the halach of Tzara is a Ptur of Yibum. It's not because of the Isser Karetz of the Erva. He says the logical reason is that if in the case of Tzara, we remove the Iser Erva, according to Rashi Tosfos, by virtue of the fact that there is a Yibum situation here, then how much more so the Erva of Achos of Eshes Achiv should be removed in the case of Yibum, in the situation of Yibum. But the only reason there's no Yibum is because the Torah says that there's no Yibum. It's a pure Yibum, not because of the Isser. Okay, now, in the next 3 or 4 minutes, depending on how much time you have, I would just like to learn with you the first Tosfos in Masechet Yevamot very quickly. This is, I think, a relatively easy Tosfos. Omeri, delo motzi leminkat arayos kiriktani b'seifa achatz mikol arayos ha'elu sheish arayos chamuros mi'elu. So the second Mishnah, which is on Daf Yud Gimel in our Gemaras, calls them arayos. Here in our Mishnah, he calls them noshim. Tosfos wants to explain and justify the difference in the Lashonos. Why is our Mishnah allergic to the word arayos, which seems to be the appropriate word, haraya? In the next Mishnah, Rebbe uses the word arayos. It says the answer lies in the Gemara on Daf Gimel Amid Beis. Mishum Damrina b'Gemara. Binyana, the Gemara wants to know why did the Mishnah have to mention the number 15? Obviously, Minyana lafuke mai, which is all of a Shas. Asi lemute saras sota vitsaras islandis umeman enes umachser gushasa. So there are a number of cases of women who, because they're not in the gather of erva, they're not included in generating what we call a tsaras erva. So a sota is not an erva, right? If a man after Kinu Vestira would have a relationship with his wife, he violates a lav of what we call tuma, but it's not an erva relationship. And all the other cases he mentions, like Machzor Gushasa, for example, is a violation of a lav, but it's not an erva. And all this was meant to be excluded by the number 15. That's called minyana lemu'ute mai. The iavitoni arayos, havi mashma dilemu'ute arayos, delo kakashiv kaasi. Had Rabbi Yehuda Nasi used in a very consistent way the word arayos instead of nashim, it would have been a problem, because then you'd have to come up with certain arayos that are excluded by virtue of the minyan 15 and only 15. But there is no such thing, says Tosfos. There's no 16th erva that was excluded from the Ptur of Yibum and Saras erva. The Minyanim is excluding Nashim Asuros. There are only 15 Nashim Asuros who generate a Ptur on that Sarah. And that's the excluding of other Nashim Asuros, like, for example, Saras Sota or Saras Machzor Gushasa. They are being excluded by virtue of the minyan 15. That would only be appropriate and only makes sense because Rebbe chose the word Nashim as opposed to Arayos. Had he chosen the word Arayos, we would have to come up with a certain Erva number 16 who does not pater up Hatzara, and there ain't no such thing. All Arayos, Ochos es Tzaros. Hey, my friends, this is where we're going to stop. I think the noise situation was tolerable. Am I right? Okay, great.
Not a problem.